At the level of this spectator consciousness, the chorus, the indifferent ground on which the performance takes place, spirit does not appear in its scattered multiplicity, but in the simple diremption of the notion. Its substance, therefore, shows itself torn asunder merely into its two extreme powers. These elementary universal beings are at the same time self-conscious individualities, heroes who place their consciousness into one of these powers, find in it determinateness of character, and constitute the effective activity and actuality of these powers. This universal individuation descends again, as will be remembered, to the immediate reality of existence and presents itself to a crowd of spectators who have in the chorus their counterpart, or rather their own thought expressing itself. Paragraph 735 is a short one, but there's a lot going on here. It's a rich paragraph, and I think it's important to think of it as following on the heels of the previous paragraph, introducing the chorus, looking at the function of the chorus in relation not just to the other narrative, we could call them personae, the gods and heroes, but especially the audience themselves. The chorus plays a kind of mediating role that is signaled at the beginning and at the end of this paragraph. So he says, at the level of this spectator consciousness. And then Miller interpolates there the chorus in brackets. But I think that's quite reasonable. Both the chorus and the audience are spectator consciousnesses, zuschauenden Bewusstsein, right? Zuschauenden, looking upon, watching, also listening, as we've seen as well. And he goes on to say that this is and it's kind of an interesting translation here, indifferent ground. We just saw the chorus as being a ground, a Boden, a base, a foundation for the action of the play. Indifferent, gleichgültigen, right? Worth about the same, right? So it's not indifferent as lacking any value whatsoever, but it's all more or less of the same value. Any particular person that you would pull out of the chorus is, an individual with a lowercase I, not a Hegelian individual. And you could pick any old person, right? This is what we call Joe Blow, or we used to joke around in my family is Canadian French, Jacques Matras, right, is the everyman, any person. And so that's, good to keep in mind. Notice that at the end, he makes this connection really clear, and he talks about a crowd, a Menge of spectators, Zuschauenden, who have in the chorus two things. And here the language is very important, right? Their counterpart, Gegenbild, and we'll come back to that word in a moment, or rather, Hegel says, their thought expressing itself. And there he's actually, what is the German? Vorstellung, right? A word that's come up here before, a word that is very important in terms of the entire religious consciousness development ultimately towards the community and philosophy, towards the concept, away from mere picture thought. In this case, the translation for Vorstellung is thought expressing itself. And that's a little bit more like a concept now, isn't it? But this is what is being provided here. This is all Vorstellung, right? The heroes, the extreme powers that are involved, but also the audience themselves and the chorus are involved in this act of representing. And so if we want to be a little bit jokey, we could say that the chorus is the representative of the audience, right, or representatives. Counterpart, Gegenbild, right? So against them, not just the counterpart as in having equal functions or opposed functions, but again, there's a representative characteristic here. Let's look at what's happening in the rest of the paragraph. He says that at the level of this spectator consciousness, and literally just in this spectator consciousness, the indifferent ground on which the performance, the Vorstellung, that's performance here, takes place, spirit does not appear in its scattered multiplicity, but in the simple diremption of the notion. And as I was reading this again, I was thinking, well, isn't that typical Hegel? Right? This is part of what makes Hegel sometimes a target for other thinkers who want to say there is multiplicity, though, right? It's not so simple as a binary this versus that. In this case, we even see that the binary is really not even that much of an opposition, right? So Hegel, over and over and over again, throughout the work, seems to love dyads. And this, I think, comes out of the Hegelian notion of opposites coming out of the very same thing, which a lot of people will read as antithesis, not always antithesis in Hegel, but we need to be careful about that. It's definitely not part of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the simplistic misreading of Hegel. But you can say that Hegel really does like twos and threes, and he's brought up a little bit earlier, and he's going to talk in the next paragraph about this multiplicity, this Mannigfaltigkeit, that was brought up earlier with respect to the gods and with respect to the political community. Instead, we're going to have a dyad of what he's calling extreme powers. Extreme meaning at one side, right? Extrema, not in the sense of like being the greatest power. And power here is Macht. So we have this diremption of the notion. Diremption, we could just say doubling, splitting, because the German for it is Entzweiung, right? Zwei, two, Entzweiung, emerging into two that are at perhaps a distance from each other, of the notion or the concept, the Begriff. So the concept of spirit is splitting into two. Splitting into two how? Well, on this ground for the spectators in the representation, representing what? Well, these, like we just said, extreme powers. Let's go back to the text. Hegel says, it's torn asunder into its true extreme powers, right? It's ripped, zerrissende. These elementary universal beings. Now, beings, Wesen, right? So essences, we could also say, right? These two elementary, and the word there, elementarische, is just a cognate. Universal, allgemeine, right? Beings in the story, in the tragedy, in the narrative. What are they? Well, they're also individualities. And here, it's very interesting because Hegel uses Individualitäten, right? And this is the plural. So we have self-conscious, selbstbewusste, individualities, and we have them in the plural. We don't have them singular, and they are the heroes, the Helden, right? If you want to say protagonists and antagonists, they are the Zeus and Prometheus, if we're talking about Prometheus Bound. They are, who else would we say? Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, and I guess these along for the ride, and Orestes watching along. They are Creon and Antigone in the Antigone. They are, it gets a little bit difficult when we get to some of the tragedies. Who is it in the Ajax? Is it Ajax and Odysseus? Is it Ajax and Athena? Sometimes it can be a little tricky to make these fit Hegel's schema. In any case, right, he says, heroes who place their consciousness into one of these powers, and what do they find in it? So this is where it gets quite interesting. Determinateness of their character, Bestimmtheit, a determination of who it is that they are, determining them not just as sort of abstract qualities, but through what it is that they actually do. Odysseus or actually, let's take somebody else instead, much more fateful. Oedipus in Oedipus Rex is going to make a choice. I need to punish this guy who killed the king, the guy who I've replaced and married his wife and made a bunch of kids with, so that I can help the land be cleared of this plague. I need knowledge. And Tiresias says to him, "You sure you want that, my lord? I don't think you want to know the answer to this." Saying, "No, I need to know." That is part of how his character is bestimmt, given determination, right? It's not just starting as a cool guy and then, everything flows from that. It is the choices that are being made. And this leads to the next thing, activity, Betätigung, right? Coming from the word tun, tat, right, that we've encountered so many times, action, right? Activity, no longer just handeln, but Betätigung, which is a different term. And then the actuality, right? The actuality is the Wirklichkeit, being made something in the world, the narrative world, the world that exists on this basis of spectator consciousness. So he says that that the heroes find in their consciousness, in these powers, in doing the things that they do, in being part of the story, and they become these powers, right? So this is how the concept is broken apart for those who are looking on, and in a certain way, by their looking on, participating in the creation of a story. The content and movement of spirit, which here is object to itself, has already been considered as the nature and realization of the ethical substance. In its religion, it attains to a consciousness of itself, or exhibits itself to consciousness in its purer form and its simpler embodiment. If then the ethical substance, in virtue of its notions, split itself as regards its content into powers which were defined as divine in human law, or law of the nether and of the upper world, the one the family, the other the state power, the first being the feminine, the second the masculine character. Similarly now, the previously multiform circle of gods with its fluctuating characteristics confines itself to these powers which are thereby brought closer to genuine individuality. For the previous dispersion of the whole into manifold and abstract forces which appear hypostatized in the dissolution of the subject, which comprehends them only as moments within itself, so that individuality is merely the superficial form of these entities. Conversely, a further distinction of characters than that just named is to be attributed to contingent and intrinsically external personality. In paragraph 736, we see Hegel doing something that he's done many times before in the Phenomenology, looking back from the vantage point of having come a certain distance in the dialectical development of consciousness and self-consciousness, back at previous sections, previous stages, previous shapes, previous dialectics in which we were doing something quite similar. And in this section, it makes perfect sense, since we're talking about Greek tragedy, that he is going to be looking back primarily to the early part of the spirit section, in which we were using something like an exposition of the Antigone to make sense out of some important cultural developments that went beyond just Greek culture and the specific situation of Thebes, to talk about some major developments in general. And so Hegel tells us that the content, the Inhalt, right, and the movement, the Bewegung of spirit, which here is object to itself, Gegenstand, right? It takes itself as an object that it can look at. Spirit is, you might say, projecting itself out of itself in this complex way. That's part of what's happening in the putting something up on the stage in Greek tragedy, and also on the part of the artist who now is no longer just a Künstler, somebody working on statues, no longer just the minstrel, the bard of the Gesänge, right, of the epic, but the tragedy and the playwright who is constructing this representation, this performance, this Vorstellung for us, and this is happening in this part of religion. So he says, here is object to itself has already been considered, has already been thought out, has already been looked at as the nature, Natur, and realization. Now here it's interesting. It's not Wirklichungen or anything like that. It's quite simply the cognate Realisation, right? Making real in a different way than making actual. This, when we talk about a producer of artistic works, particularly in terms of film, and we think about the realizer of it, it's the one who brings it to the stage or to the screen or to the streaming medium these days and makes it possible for us to see it. And I think we could look at it in this way. It's a little anachronistic to read that in, but I think that works. So he says, the nature and realization of what? The ethical substance, the sittliche Substanz that we've been talking about throughout, really, the second part of the reason section, all the way into spirit and now into religion. So he says that in its religion, now notice that term there. He doesn't say in religion, right? In its religion, seine Religion, right? This is an important point. It's not just in religion per se, it's in this particular mode of religion. And, we're looking at Greek tragedy here, but we might also think about passion plays. We might also think about other depictions, other kinds of drama, which are dealing with heroic characters, heroic in some sense, perhaps saintly characters in some senses, and the gods or the spiritual powers, right? So he goes on and he says, in its religion, it attains to a consciousness of itself or exhibits itself to consciousness in its purer form and its simpler embodiment. So there's something that has changed, something that has become refined, purified along the way. From what? And this is where we raise kind of an interesting question. Well, back in the spirit section, weren't we talking about Greek tragedy? I mean, bringing in the Antigone as one of the high points of Sophoclean tragedy. How are we not already engaging with Greek drama at that point? And Hegel could say, well, it wasn't as refined what we were doing in spirit. It was really less about the drama itself and much more about the things that it was supposed to be depicting, the social struggles, the diremption, Entzweiung that we talked about in the last paragraph. And so he says, if the ethical substance, in virtue of its notion, in virtue of its concept, split itself as regards its content, the Inhalt, into powers which were defined, and now he goes through a whole sequence, divine and human law, or the law of the nether and the upper world, the one the family, the other the state power, the first being the feminine, and the second the masculine character. Okay, so that's what was going on in that early spirit section, right? Where we talked about these two different laws, and again, depicted in the Antigone, refined in Hegel's analysis of it, seemingly present there in Greek and many other societies. He goes on and he says, similarly now, so in Greek tragedy, in the religious aspect of it, we have something else going on. Now, I want to come back to something. In the previous paragraph, we mentioned that there's this very common Hegelian, let's call it, feature or shtick of wanting to focus on duality rather than on multiplicity as such. Why? Because multiplicity is really kind of a mess. It's hard to manage, things emerge. This is not, for example, Nietzsche or Deleuze or anybody else who's looking at Hegel and saying this is very dualistic a lot of the time. Hegel does have a preference for this, and he says that this previous multiform, so a multiplicity, Mannigfaltigkeit, circle, Kreis, of gods, of deities that we talked about in previous paragraphs, this previous kind of messy, set of overlapping narratives where the gods are this, the gods are that. Hegel views that as rather abstract. It becomes crystallized into the tragedy in a way that we'll talk about. So the previous multiform circle of gods with fluctuating characteristics confines itself. Now, this is important. There's two different, let's call them filterings or restrictions. It's not that stuff isn't there, right? And Hegel's saying, get rid of it, censor it, suppress it. He's just saying, no, there's this natural process of zeroing in on things being on two sides. I mean, we can think about the Iliad, for example, right? As a prime example of this. You have two sides that the gods both take part in, as well as the heroes. Of course, there's always the risk of falling into multiplicity within the Greek camp, right? Agamemnon and Achilles are at odds with each other. Ajax hates the guts out of Odysseus, and we go on and on and on. So he says here, these are brought they are confining themselves to these powers, which are thereby brought closer to genuine, not just plain old, but genuine individuality. Right? Individuality here is the same individualitet that was talked about in the previous paragraph. So now it is singular, right? They are being brought to, or abstract, you could say, to eigentlich, genuine, real individuality. And he says the previous dispersion, again, a multiplicity is a dispersion into manifold, mannigfaltig, right? And abstract forces, which appeared hypostatized, meaning, this is a translation here of were present as substances, right? It is the dissolution of the subject. And here it's subject, right? Which comprehends them only as moments within itself, so that individuality is merely the superficial form of these entities. This sounds suspiciously like Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy and talking about what's going on from, you might say, the Dionysian point of view, except that, of course, the Birth of Tragedy is written decades after this. So Hegel already has his finger on something that is going to come up in that great work, which Nietzsche says is too Hegelian, by the way. And it says, comprehends them only as moments within itself. Individuality is merely the superficial form of these entities. Conversely, Hegel says, a further distinction of characters than that just named is to be attributed to contingent, zufälliges, and intrinsically external personality, personalitet, something different than individualitet, right? And so contingent, zufälligen, and intrinsically external, an sich außerlichen, right? So there's a filtering here, a concentration going on that is, to some degree, we could say it's artificial. Important voices are being left out, but they're being left out because either they're, too many different voices at the same time, or because they are merely contingent. We want tragedy, the ancient Greeks wanted tragedy, to talk about something universal, something that appeals to us as spectators to get to see a story that isn't just about schmucks like us, and may impart some wisdom or offer some possibility for, as Aristotle pointed out, and as we talked about in a few paragraphs earlier, catharsis, purification from affects of what? What is it that the audience feels? Pity and fear. So there's a lot going on in this introduction of the chorus and this moving back to talking about the subject of tragedy, which is involving this sort of narrowing in on who the key players, the key played, really, the key characters are going to be.